Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to talk about conceivability and modality. So some propositions are necessarily true. They could not have been false. It's necessarily true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that all bachelors are unmarried. Other propositions are merely contingently true. Although they are true, they could have been false. For instance, I decided to study philosophy, but I could have done something different with my life. I could have become a chemist instead. London is the capital of England, but had the country developed differently, the capital might have been placed elsewhere, say in Bristol. So, this is all fairly familiar. These are modal facts, facts about necessity and possibility, facts about how things must have been or how things could have been. Now, one of the central questions in epistemology is, well, how do we gain knowledge of the modal facts? Now, first of all, we should note that there are different kinds of modality, and in particular, philosophers often distinguish between logical, physical, and metaphysical modality. So, logical possibility is usually framed in terms of the syntactic form of statements. So a common way to put this is that a statement is logically possible just in case it does not entail a contradiction. So that is, it does not entail a statement of the form P and not P. So for instance, the proposition, if the sky is blue, then it is not the case that the sky is blue. Well, that's impossible, just in virtue of its logical form. So basically the idea is P is some proposition P is logically possible just in case it is consistent with the laws of logic. Physical possibility is a matter of compatibility with the known physical laws. So we might say, for instance, that it's not possible for an object to accelerate beyond the speed of light, or it's not possible for there to be a mountain made of pure plutonium. These are statements of physical possibility. The laws of physics rule these out. So a proposition P is physically possible just in case P is consistent with the physical laws. But we might think that the physical laws could have been different. Perhaps the universe could have been Newtonian or Aristotelian, or perhaps it could have had some other set of laws undreamt of. Had the laws been different, maybe it would have been possible for an object to accelerate beyond the speed of light, right? Like if you change the laws of physics, maybe you could accelerate beyond the speed of light, or maybe you could have a mountain made of pure plutonium. So we might think that acceleration beyond the speed of light and mountains made of plutonium actually are possible in some other sense. And this brings us to metaphysical possibility. Now, it's difficult to give a simple characterization of what metaphysical possibility is supposed to be. Metaphysical possibility is generally taken to be broader than physical possibility, but narrower than logical possibility. So here's a simple diagram that I've taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So the idea is that some things are metaphysically possible that are not physically possible, such as plutonium mountains. But then there are some statements that are logically possible, but that are not metaphysically possible. So take, for instance, the identity claim that water is H2O. Now, we'll take it that this is true. We'll take it that water is H2O. Water just is H2O. Now, clearly there's no logical contradiction in the statement water is not H2O, at least not in virtue of the form of the statement alone. So this is logically possible. It's logically possible that water is not H2O. But many philosophers hold that given the fact that water just is H2O, then even if the laws of physics had been different, there couldn't have been water that was not H2O. Right? Water is H2O in every possible world. Even God could not bring it about that water is not H2O. So water is not H2O is not metaphysically possible. It's logically possible, but not metaphysically possible. Now, of course, I should say that, pretty much everything that I've just explained is controversial, right? This is just the sort of standard way of distinguishing between some of these different kinds of possibility. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, there are a number of arguments in philosophy that concern metaphysical modality, right? There are a number of arguments that sort of appeal to this notion of metaphysical possibility. So here's just one example, a famous example, the zombie argument against physicalism. So according to physicalists, all that exists are physical properties. So physicalists will hold that, the mind, consciousness, is ultimately a matter of, arrangement. It's grounded in physical properties. It's a matter of the arrangements of physical stuff. So now consider a philosophical zombie. A philosophical zombie has exactly the same physical properties as an ordinary person. So it's molecule for molecule identical to an ordinary person, but it has no consciousness. There is nothing it's like to be a philosophical zombie. Zombies they're exactly alike. They're like us in all physical respects. So they behave the same way. There's the same physical processes going on inside them, but it's just all dark inside. They're not conscious. Okay, so that's the idea. Now here's the argument. Premise one: if physicalism is true, then any being which has the same physical properties as S must have the same mental properties as S. Premise two: we can conceive of a zombie counterpart of S. So for any person, for any conscious person, we can conceive of something that is physically identical to that person, but that is not conscious. Premise three: whatever is conceivable is metaphysically possible. So it is metaphysically possible that there is a zombie counterpart of S. So physicalism is false. Basically, there is more to consciousness than the physical facts alone. Why? Well, because even with all of the physical facts given, it is still possible that there is no consciousness, right? There could be a world where you have exactly the same physical states but no consciousness. For the physicalist, conscious states are just constituted by certain physical states. So by fixing the physical facts, we fix the facts about consciousness. There's nothing more to do. So if zombies are possible, if there is a possible world, even maybe it has different laws of physics, but whatever, as long as there is a possible world in which there is something that has the same physical states but that is not conscious, then physicalism must be false. That's a brief summary of the argument. Hopefully, the point here is not to argue against physicalism. I'm just trying to illustrate, how philosophers very often will kind of reason about metaphysical possibility. For our purposes, the crucial step here is premise three. Premise three claims that whatever is conceivable is metaphysically possible, and that allows us to infer from the conceivability of zombies to their possibility. And this, of course, brings us to the central question of this video. Well, how do we actually have knowledge of metaphysical possibility? How can we tell what must have been the case, or what could have been otherwise, or what could not have been the case? And a common view, and it's the view that underlies the zombie argument, is this idea that conceivability is the guide to possibility. So this was expressed by Hume. So Hume said that it is, and I quote, an established maxim in metaphysics that whatever the mind clearly conceives includes the idea of possible existence, or in other words, that nothing we imagine is absolutely impossible. So yes, we can imagine things that are impossible given the laws of physics. But the idea is, as long as I clearly conceive of something, then it's not absolutely impossible. It's not metaphysically impossible. So we can call this Hume's maxim, right? If it is conceivable that P, then it is possible that P. We might endorse a weaker principle along the same lines, that conceivability indicates possibility or is evidence for possibility, even if it doesn't strictly entail possibility. So we would then say that if it is conceivable that P, then we have some justification for believing that it is possible that P. I see that what I've written there on that slide is wrong. That should say, if it is conceivable that P, then we have some justification for believing that it is possible that P. So, mess that up, but never mind. You get the point, right? The point is the conceivability is evidence for possibility. And of course, we might hold also that inconceivability indicates impossibility. So if we cannot conceive that P, then we have some justification for believing that it is impossible that P. So on this view, modal knowledge, our knowledge of possibility and necessity, is derived from our ability to conceive of things. So I want to say, it's possible that Frank Zappa never came into existence. How do I know that this is possible? Well, because I can conceive of a world in which Frank Zappa's parents never met and so never had a child. Or I can conceive of a world in which gravity was much stronger so that the universe collapsed seconds after the Big Bang. I can imagine a variety of scenarios in which Frank Zappa never exists. By contrast, it's impossible to install a window shaped like a round square. I know there can't be anything in the shape of a round square because when I try to conceive of a round square, I just can't do it. Stephen Yablo, in his article, Is Conceivability a Guide to Possibility?, suggests that the basic motivation for Hume's maxim is that conceiving is importantly analogous to perceiving. So Yablo says, just as someone who perceives that P enjoys the appearance that P is true, whoever finds P conceivable enjoys something worth describing as the appearance that it is possible. So when I open my eyes and look in front of me, there's the appearance of a computer. And it appears to be true that there's a computer in front of me. And that justifies me in it gives me some justification for believing that indeed there is a computer in front of me. It's not infallible justification. Maybe I might learn that I'm hallucinating or in some other way deceived, but I have some, prima facie justification for trusting my perceptual states. Along the same lines, when I conceive a world in which Frank Zappa's parents never met, this has the appearance of possibility. So that gives me some justification for thinking that it is indeed possible that his parents never met and that he never came into existence. Again, maybe this isn't infallible justification. I might be in some way deceived, but we don't need infallibility, right? So we can apply this idea fairly straightforwardly in philosophical argument, right? Philosophers come up with some thought experiment which they claim allows us to conceive of some scenario. This shows that the scenario is possible, and then some broader philosophical conclusion is drawn from this. Note that if conceivability delivers knowledge of the modal facts in this kind of way, then this does explain how philosophy can deliver reliable knowledge from the armchair. We don't need to go out and perform empirical experiments in order to uncover metaphysical modality. Thought experiments are enough. So it would be very nice for philosophers if Hume's maxim were true. But is it true? Well, the big question here is, what exactly does it mean to conceive of something, right? If we claim that conceivability indicates possibility, then we need to say something about what conceivability is. Francesco Berto and Tom Schunan, in their article Conceivability and Possibility, suggest that there are at least two ways of thinking about this, and this derives from work in cognitive psychology that distinguishes two types of mental representation, linguistic and pictorial. So this distinction can be put in terms of the arbitrariness of the mapping relation between the representation and the thing represented. In the case of linguistic representation, then there does not need to be any particular relation between the representation and the target. So the word cat, for instance, is nothing like a cat. There's just an arbitrary convention that sets up the connection between the word and the object. So linguistic representations have no relation to any sensory modality, right? Cat doesn't look like a cat, it doesn't sound like a cat, it doesn't feel like a cat, right? By contrast, in the case of pictorial representation, there's some sort of similarity between the representation and the target. So a picture of a cat looks like a cat in some sense. Now, of course, pictorial is being used in a broader sense than usual because I might make a meow sound to represent the meowing of a cat. That would be a pictorial representation in our sense because there's a similarity between the sound I've made and the sound I'm representing. When I go meow, that's similar to the sound made by a cat. It's not an arbitrary convention. So, I mean, when we say pictorial representation, maybe we should say something like sensory or quasi-sensory representation. That might be a better way to put it. But hopefully you get the point, right? Like linguistic representation, in the case of linguistic representation, the relation between the representation and the target is arbitrary. In the case of pictorial representation, there's some sort of similarity. So that means there's these two types of mental representation, and once we have that, we can then distinguish two ways of understanding what it would be to conceive that P. So let's first of all suppose that conceiving that P involves some sort of linguistic representation that P, right? So basically, to conceive that P is to have, you know, a linguistic representation that P. It's kind of to have like words in the head to the effect that P. Now, Berto and Schunen say that if there are linguistic representations, it's plausible that they would obey what they call the parity assumption, which is whatever content is representable by a natural language sentence is also representable by some linguistic mental representation. So the thought here is just that understanding natural language is supposed to be grounded in some sense in, you know, what goes on in our minds. And any natural language sentence that I speak is a sentence that I can also think about. So I can, you know, for any sentence that I'm able to say, I can also token the sentence in my mind. I can think the sentence. So when we form a linguistic representation, the thought is all that's really required is that we have meaningful words related to each other in grammatically correct ways, and you know that this is understood. So basically the thought here is that to conceive that P, in this sense, requires that, first of all, I understand the words that are used in stating that P. Secondly, these words are put together in a grammatically correct way, and then maybe also I can make further inferences from P, right? I can say, you know, I can kind of elaborate on what might follow if P were the case. I can tell some sort of further story about P. Now the thing is, if this is what we mean by conceivability, then, well, it looks pretty clear that we can actually conceive of impossibilities. This is not a sense of conceivability that is going to work for Hume's maxim. Indeed, it seems like we can conceive of basically anything, provided that it's expressed in a grammatically correct sentence in which all of the terms are understood. So let's say, you know, I say, okay, look, I have a sheet of cardboard that is both round and square, right? So can I conceive of a round, square piece of cardboard? Well, I mean, I know what cardboard is. I know what it is for something to be round. I know what it is for something to be square. So I understand all of these words, and this sentence obeys the rules of English grammar, and I can make further inferences from it. So I might infer that, you know, I might say, well, you know, if I were to attempt to cover a window of a particular size with this round, square sheet of cardboard, the cardboard both would and would not block out all of the light. So you know, I've conceived of a round square piece of cardboard. I mean, similarly, I can conceive in this sense of a surface that's both red and blue all over, of two people, each of whom is taller than the other, of a set of all sets that are not members of themselves, of a greatest prime number, and so on. Now, I mean, one option here would be to claim that these sentences are just meaningless. So when I say there is a round square piece of cardboard, or the table is red all over and blue all over, I've just uttered a completely meaningless string. It's analogous to saying, you know, flib, flob, flub, right? And there are philosophical theories of meaning which might render these meaningless. I mean, verificationism, for instance. I just note one immediate problem with this move. It seems like we can understand these sentences well enough to judge that there is something wrong with them in virtue of their semantic content. So when I say, I have a round square piece of cardboard, the natural reaction to that is, well, no you don't, right? What you've said is false. And it's false because there can't be something that is both round and square simultaneously, right? So if somebody claims to have a round square piece of cardboard, you would doubt their claim. It's not as though they've just said something that's like a meaningless string of nonsense poetry, where you're just kind of baffled by, like, wait, what the hell are you even saying? Or I mean, we might note that there are many sentences that are contradictory, but where this wasn't immediately obvious. So take, for instance, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Well, that set would be contradictory, but that's a discovery. I mean, we have to work out the consequences to see that it's contradictory. And so if that were just a meaningless string, then, what were we inquiring about, right? How could we work out what it entails? So that seems to be, so yes, the appeal to meaninglessness here is maybe problematic. But in any case, the worry is that if we understand conceivability in terms of linguistic representation, then it's just going to overgenerate, and Hume's maxim will be false because we will be able to conceive of impossibilities. Now, if you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where there are a whole load of bonus videos. It is, of course, conceivable that you would be able to view all of those videos without giving me money, but that's not how things are in the actual world. So if you want to see more of me, then you got to give me some cash, okay? If you want to support the channel, in other ways, you can also just throw me some money through PayPal. I really appreciate people's support. It takes a long time to put these videos together, and the support that you people do offer, it helps to pay the bills. It really does make a difference, so it's appreciated. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, a master's and a PhD in philosophy, so that's my background. I'm more than qualified, I think. And you can also join the Discord. The links to all of this will be in the description. And of course, I mean, I also have to say that if you can't support me in any of these ways, you can at least give the video a like, give the video a comment. That just helps the algorithm. It helps get it seen, right? So I would appreciate that as well. Any engagement helps. All right, let's get back to the philosophy. So if we are to defend Hume's maxim, then we must be appealing to conceivability in a different sense. There's more to conceiving than having a linguistic mental representation, than having words in the head. So let's turn to pictorial representation. So this is usually understood in terms of imagination. For instance, this is proposed by Stephen Yablo in his article, Is Conceivability a Guide to Possibility? So Yablo says, and I quote, "Conceiving that P is a way of imagining that P. It is imagining that P by imagining a world of which P is held to be a true description." So take, for example, the claim, this is Yablo's example, that there is a tiger behind the curtain. What is it to conceive that there's a tiger behind the curtain? Well, I imagine a tiger with its various properties. So I imagine various body parts, particular colours and shapes, maybe the stripes of the fur and so on. I imagine various other things are arranged in a particular way. So, there's going to be a curtain, there's maybe going to be a window, there's going to be a floor, maybe. So I've kind of got like a picture of these things, right? Arranged in a particular way. And what I've done here is I've imagined a situation in which the proposition, "there is a tiger behind the curtain," is true. There are various different situations I could imagine that would make that proposition true. I might imagine a tiger with a different colour, I might imagine the tiger facing in a different direction, but there's a broad range of situations where, if there were such things arranged in such ways, then the proposition, "there is a tiger behind the curtain," would be true. And that's what it is to conceive of that proposition. So conceivability in Yablo's sense works as follows. First, I imagine a world or a situation. This will involve imagining some arrangement of objects and properties, and this isn't a matter of stipulation. I can't just say the words "round, square, piece of cardboard." I have to actually be able to see how roundness and squareness could fit together in the way, similarly I can see like how you can sort of fit together squareness and blueness. I can get a blue square, I can like get a square and paint it blue, but how do I fit together like a square and then make it round, right? But I have to actually do that. Then I must, after having arranged the objects and properties in that way, I have to determine whether some proposition P is true in that world. And if I've done that, then I've conceived that P. So to say that P is conceivable is to say I can imagine a world that I take to verify that P. That's the basic idea. And now, we need not imagine the situation down to every detail. Many features of the situation will be left unspecified. When I imagine the tiger, I don't imagine a specific number of stripes. Nevertheless, I imagine that the tiger has some specific number of types. So I can suppose that the tiger I imagine has the property for some n having n stripes, even though I don't actually imagine all of those n stripes. And this actually works, much the same way as perception, right? When I see a tiger, I see that it has a determinate number of stripes, though I may not have actually counted the stripes, and I don't know how many stripes exactly it has. So, certain features of the situation will be unspecified, but that's not to say that they are literally indeterminate. Okay, so this is the thought, this is the basic idea. Now, the question, of course, is, well, what exactly is involved in imagining a situation? Well, again, Berto and Schumann distinguish two possibilities here. So we can think of imagination as involving what they call pure pictorial representation. On this view, imagination involves mental imagery only, where this imagery represents without any language-like element. So if you just form the mental image of a tiger, like if I just say, think of a tiger, and then, you kind of have like, a picture in your mind's eye, as it were, that's probably close, at least, to just purely pictorial representation. Now, I should note it's controversial, actually, whether there can be any purely pictorial representations. The problem is, well, many philosophers hold that similarity alone is never going to be enough for representation. A mental image can only be a mental image of a tiger, for instance, if you have already assigned some, meaning to it. Like, precisely the same arrangement of qualitative features could just as well represent a photograph of a tiger, or it could represent an endangered animal, or it could represent a country, or it might represent a person's anger, right? Or pretty much anything else. So, without some linguistic element, without some labeling element, you're just not going to be able to imagine anything in particular. That's one worry. But I think putting that aside, there's a more serious problem here, which is purely pictorial representation, assuming it's possible, would be extremely limited. It would allow us to conceive only of those things that manifest as arrangements of sensory qualities. So we would only be able to conceive of material objects distributed in space-time. We wouldn't be able to conceive of abstract objects. We wouldn't be able to conceive even of many of the properties of material objects, like, gravity, for instance. I mean, what's the image of Newton's law of the universal gravitation? In fact, even with respect to sensory qualities, only a limited number would be available. I mean, presumably you can't form an image of a million-sided shape. Like, you can't literally all at once see every one of the million sides. So purely pictorial representation is obviously not sufficient for modal epistemology. I mean, maybe this would support the conditional that if P is conceivable, then P is possible, but so few things would count as conceivable that I don't think this would really have any application in our philosophical arguments. So this leaves us then with the idea that imagination represents through a combination of pictorial and linguistic features. What Berto and Schumann call the pictorial cum labeling account. So to see how this works, consider a map of a village. The map shows the location of roads and houses. It shows maybe natural features like the sea, the forest, and so on. Let's say that there's a famous stone circle marked on the map with an X. Now, this map is partly pictorial. It represents the location of various objects partly via the similarity of spatial relations, and obviously that's what allows us to use the map to get around the territory, but it's also partly linguistic. It's purely conventional that X represents a stone circle. I mean, the X symbol doesn't look anything like a stone circle. It's purely conventional that one object being drawn above another on the map represents the object being to the north of the other. I mean, the map could have been drawn the other way round. So the map involves both a pictorial and a linguistic element. And so maybe the kind of imagination, this is what's involved in the kind of imagination that's relevant to conceivability, right? So to conceive that P is to, imagine a situation that verifies that P, where the imagination is like both pictorial and linguistic, it's mixed. Now the trouble with this is that once we allow that there is a labeling component analogous to the map, then it looks like we can once again imagine basically anything. So let's take again the round square. Here's an example. I think this comes from Roy Sorensen, but I forget the article. So if anybody knows where this comes from, let me know, because I think it's from Sorensen, but I can't remember exactly where. So if it's Sorensen, then Sorensen suggests that actually we can picture a round square. It's very simple. Here are two ways to do it. So I have, first of all, there the little dot. That's a round square as seen from a distance. The line there is the round square seen from the side. Now, I mean, obviously the natural reaction to these examples is to say, no, you're cheating. You're not really picturing a round square when you do that. But, bear in mind that for literally anything that you picture, you're only going to picture some of its properties from some perspective or other. I mean, I have here a picture of a cube, and I think we would all accept that as a perfectly reasonable picture of a cube. But it only shows three faces of the cube from a particular perspective. And in fact, for all that's shown here, I might as well be representing a flat surface. Indeed, the picture itself is a flat surface, right? So, I mean, really what I suppose we're pushing at here is this question of what exactly counts as a, genuine image of something, or a genuine representation of something, or perhaps I should say like a canonical representation. We want to say that the little dot, that's not a canonical representation of a round square. But what would a canonical representation be? I have a video called Realism in Art that gets into that particular topic a little bit more detail, so I'll link that in the comments. In any case, the thought is, well, we're allowing representation to take place partly through labeling, and in that case, I mean, it seems difficult to deny that I have in fact given you a picture of a round square from a great distance. I mean, it would certainly put the cart before the horse to insist that, well, look, a round square is impossible, so that couldn't be a picture of a round square from a distance because there couldn't be a round square. I mean, whether or not the round square is impossible is exactly the claim to be demonstrated here. Certainly, our round square from a distance seems more legitimate a picture of a round square than the letter X does a stone circle, right? So it's true that, of course, I can't picture what a round square would look like face up, sort of face on, up close, in good light, and so on. But we noted earlier that to conceive that P is to imagine a situation that verifies that P, and when imagining any situation, there are going to be multiple ways to imagine it, and multiple things that are left unimagined. When I imagine the tiger behind the curtain, I don't need to imagine every single strand of fur, and indeed I can't imagine every single strand of fur, but that's still, I still count as imagining a tiger. The round square doesn't obviously seem to be any worse off than anything else we might conceive. Like, we can conceive a round square from certain perspectives, right? We can conceive certain of its properties. We can imagine, that is, we can imagine certain of its properties. And so that counts as imagining a round square. Why not? Yeah, the worry is that if we allow mixed representation, then we end up with this problem that, again, basically anything is just going to become conceivable. And we're going to be able to conceive of impossibilities. Now, of course, this still leaves an option open for the defender of Hume's maxim. The defender of Hume's maxim might argue that conceiving is neither linguistic nor pictorial. But then, as Berto and Schunen argue, the defender of Hume's maxim is assuming that there must be some third code of mental representation for which, well, there's currently no evidence. I mean, they claim at least that mainstream cognitive psychology does not postulate this mysterious third code. And I suppose, if we just reflect on cases where we imagine things, I mean, doesn't seem like there's a third code. I mean, we have, quasi-linguistic thoughts, we have quasi-sensory mental images. What's the third thing? Like, what other thing is there beyond this that could, I mean, I suppose maybe we can postulate things beyond this. I don't know, maybe emotions count as something different, but there doesn't seem to be anything beyond this that could do the job of Hume's maxim that conceivability is a guide to possibility. So yes, we would need to, if we take this option, then we need to come up with some evidence or some argument that there's a third code of representation, and then we need to show how it avoids the sorts of problems that we've seen for linguistic and pictorial representation, so that it can do the job of indicating possibility. So there are some problems then with Hume's maxim, but the problems don't end there. Let's put aside the question of what exactly it means to conceive of something. There are still further issues with the maxim that conceivability indicates possibility. So one of the most influential objections to Hume's maxim is the idea that there are a posteriori impossibilities. The idea is that there are some propositions which are impossible, which could not be true, but where this can only be known on the basis of experience. So one example that's made famous by Saul Kripke concerns identity statements. The morning star is the evening star. Initially, we thought that there were two different stars, one in the morning and one in the evening, a different one. But as it turns out, these are both the same thing. Now consider, is it possible that the morning star is not the evening star? That is there a possible world in which these are two different objects? Well, according to Kripke, no, it isn't possible. Now, of course, it's possible that there is one star that is called the morning star and another different star that is called the evening star. So that is, there's a possible world in which human beings decided to use the phrases differently. They named things differently. That's possible, obviously, but that's not what we're asking. The question is whether the object that is in fact named by the phrase the morning star could have been distinct from the object that is in fact named by the phrase the evening star, and surely the answer to that is no, because that would mean that the object is distinct from itself. And that, the argument goes, doesn't make any sense. So it's impossible that the morning star is distinct from the evening star. However, the identity of the morning star with the evening star, that was something that was discovered through empirical investigation. Things could have turned out differently. And when I say could have, I mean that in the epistemic sense. Given the information that was available to people at a particular time in the past, well, it was compatible with that information that the morning star was distinct from the evening star. So this is an impossibility that was discovered a posteriori. But then surely this is just to say that it's conceivable that the morning star is distinct from the evening star, because we can imagine a situation in which it turns out that these are two different things, right? One way to put this is, since the identity of the morning star and the evening star was revealed through experience, there must be some alternative series of experiences that would have shown them to be distinct instead. If there was no alternative series of experiences that would have shown them to be distinct, then we wouldn't have needed to use experience to reveal their identity, right? If there's only one way things could have gone, then we wouldn't have needed to check. So there is some alternative sequence of experiences, some alternative things that could have happened that would have shown them to be distinct. And so, and surely we can conceive of those alternative series of experiences. So the proposition, the morning star is not the evening star, that is impossible, but it is conceivable. And so we can conceive the impossible. So this, as I said, fairly famous objection to Hume's maxim. Yablo responds to this objection, I think reasonably convincingly, as follows. So he says, well, what we have to be careful about what it is we're actually imagining, right? So what we're imagining in this case, right, when we say, well, there's some alternative sequence of experiences that would have shown them to be distinct, what we're imagining here is you're imagining acquiring evidence that convinces you that some proposition is true. So I imagine people acquiring evidence that convinces them that the morning star is distinct from the evening star. But to conceive of acquiring evidence that convinces you that P is not the same as to conceive that P. So it might just be the case that the evidence acquired is misleading. And I mean, look, of course it's conceivable that a person, could be persuaded of almost any proposition P, but that doesn't pose any problems for Hume's maxim, because it's also, it's also possible for a person to believe almost any proposition P, right? I can conceive that people will come to believe impossibilities, and it's possible that there are people who believe impossibilities. So no problem there. I mean, it's not just possible that people believe impossibilities. It's actually the case that people believe impossibilities. Some of the things that some people believe are actually impossible. So there's no challenge to Hume's maxim here. So Yablo says, look, it's not enough to imagine a situation in which people believe that the morning star is distinct from the evening star, or in which people acquire evidence that the morning star is distinct from the evening star. We need to imagine a situation in which this belief is actually true. And that means we need to imagine that this object, where I'm, the object, the one named by the morning star, right, that object is distinct from this object, the one named by the evening star. And that, according to Yablo, is something that we really can't conceive. I mean, we can't conceive of this any more than we can conceive of the morning star being distinct from the morning star, right? We can't conceive of an object being distinct from itself. All right, when you conceive of an object, you're just conceiving of the object, not some different object. I just can't do that. So what's happening here is, in some other possible world in which people use the terms the morning star and the evening star differently, so that they name distinct objects, well, those people might nevertheless have qualitatively identical experiences to us. And, for a long time, for all we knew, this possible world was the actual world. For all we knew, we lived in a world in which the phrases the morning star and the evening star named distinct objects. And this misleads us into thinking that it is conceivable that the morning star is distinct from the evening star, as we actually use those terms. And of course, this raises an important point, right? We might sometimes think that we can imagine that P, but we might be mistaken about what it is that we are imagining. People can be misled about the modal facts. The problem lies not with Hume's maxim, right? The problem does not lie with the idea that conceivability indicates possibility. The problem is we're not always reliable at identifying just what it is that we are conceiving. So this is Yablo's response. Now, so maybe that response deals with this idea of a posteriori impossibilities, but it does raise another concern. So this point about modal error, about error about what it is that we are conceiving, this leads to a final objection to Hume's maxim, Van Inwagen's modal skepticism, which he proposes in his paper Modal Epistemology. So Van Inwagen accepts Yablo's account of conceivability for the sake of argument, but he argues that this has skeptical implications that Yablo overlooks. So Yablo's aim was to, vindicate Hume's maxim. Van Inwagen argues that Yablo's own account of conceivability undermines the idea that we can have knowledge of possibility. Now, I should say Van Inwagen grants that in some circumstances our modal judgments are reliable. When it comes to sort of everyday modal knowledge, or modal judgments within science. So if I say it is possible that John F. Kennedy should have died of natural causes, or it is necessary that two mountains touching at their base should form a valley, Van Inwagen accepts that we know those, but he thinks we should be very skeptical of our judgments of metaphysical possibility. And in particular, we should be skeptical of the sorts of modal claims that philosophers make in things like the zombie argument. So recall that for Yablo, he says that so P is conceivable just in case we can imagine a situation that verifies P. Now Yablo grants we might sometimes be mistaken about what we think we're imagining, right? So we might think that we're imagining a situation that verifies P, but in fact the situation does no such thing. And this is the point that Van Inwagen users to put some pressure on the rest of Diablo's account. So consider the case of transparent iron. Could there be a world in which there is transparent iron? Well, I mean, this is so, for someone like Diablo, the way that we approach this is we try to conceive of transparent iron, and probably, I mean, most philosophers would say yes, that is conceivable, right? I mean, maybe it's not possible given the actual laws of physics, but the laws could be different, right? In a world in which there are different laws, sure, you can have transparent iron, right? I mean, I can imagine. I can imagine a piece of transparent iron. So let's say, for instance, we imagine a group of scientists at a Nobel Prize acceptance speech. The speaker is describing his discovery of transparent iron, and he holds in his hand something that looks like a chunk of glass, but it's actually iron, right? It looks like glass, but it's iron. Okay, so I mean, what's going on here is it looks like glass, and we're labeling it iron. Now, the question is, have we actually imagined a world in which there's transparent iron? Well, Van Inwagen says no, right? The situation that we've imagined is compatible with a large number of propositions. So it is compatible with the claim that there is transparent iron, sure, but it's also compatible with the claim that the scientific community has been misled into thinking that transparent iron exists, right? It's compatible with the claim that a physicist who thinks that he's created transparent iron is the butt of an elaborate prank, right? So when we say, I mean, I'm saying like, look, this physicist is holding in his hand something that, it looks like glass, but it's actually iron. Now, the trouble is, I mean, what am I imagining there? Well, I'm just imagining something that looks like glass and that everybody is labeling iron. But that's, I mean, okay, yes, that's compatible with it being transparent iron, but it's also compatible with it not being iron, and the people who are labeling it iron just being deceived into thinking that it's iron, and so on. So I'm not actually imagining a world in which there's transparent iron. I'm imagining a world in which either there's transparent iron, or people are deceived into thinking that there's transparent iron, or etc. etc. There's probably many other possibilities we could plug in there. So what would be required to genuinely imagine transparent iron? Well, we would need to imagine a sample of metal down to the atomic detail. We would need to imagine the laws of nature, and we would need to imagine them in sufficient detail to see how the atomic structure of the substance, in conjunction with the behavior of photons, could give rise to transparency. So we need to kind of have in our minds some idea of like what the atomic structure of this metal is, and then we'd need to show that atomic structure is iron, right? And then we'd also need to show how like the behavior of the atoms and the molecules allows photons to pass through. And this is something that no one has ever done. Now, maybe it would be possible in principle to do this, but it would require significant developments within physics, right? I mean, we're in the domain of theoretical physics. So a good example of conceiving in this sense would be the theoretical work on islands of stability among the super heavy elements. So the idea is current physics, according to some physicists at least, predicts that there are certain isotopes of super heavy elements that will have much longer half-lives than the known isotopes of those elements. So for instance, all known isotopes of flavorium have half-lives of seconds or milliseconds, but flavorium-298 might have a half-life of several days. Now, when scientists imagine flavorium-298 having a half-life of several days, they don't just imagine a bunch of scientists accepting a Nobel Prize or anything like that. No, what they do is they work out the consequences of well-established physical theories, and then, this is going to show that flavorium-298 should have certain properties, like a closed neutron shell, and blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of detail provided here. Now, until we've done this kind of thing for transparent iron, we haven't actually imagined transparent iron. So basically, we've got two options. Either we show how transparent iron is possible within our own laws of physics, or we show how transparent iron could arise given other laws of physics, while also showing that those alternative laws are possible. And nobody's ever done that. Of course, showing that alternative laws of physics are possible is a very tricky matter. I mean, I suppose we could proceed by sort of, maybe if we accept something like, a multiverse hypothesis, maybe there's some underlying mechanism that generates universes that have different laws. Again, we'd have to show how that could work in detail, right? And then maybe we could show that there are universes that could have these alternative laws of physics where there might be transparent iron. But again, nobody's ever done this. So we haven't imagined transparent iron. We have not conceived of transparent iron, and there's just no reason to think that it is actually possible. And what goes for transparent iron also goes, Van Inwagen says, for many of the modal claims that are found in popular philosophical arguments. So think about philosophical zombies. Could there be a being that is molecule for molecule identical to me, but that has no conscious experiences? Well, I mean, I guess first of all, it's not actually clear that I can imagine a being that's molecule for molecule identical to me, period. Can I imagine things in that kind of detail? But put that aside, right? Even if I can imagine something that's, shares all of my physical properties, I'm certainly not imagining what the relevant laws would be that would then make it such that that being is not conscious. I mean, it may not be obvious to us why certain physical states realize certain conscious states. Similarly, it may not be obvious to us why arrangements of iron molecules are opaque, but that alone, right, our inability to see why it is that certain physical states are conscious, that doesn't amount to imagining that there are the same physical states but that are not conscious. In the same way, right, the fact that I'm unable to figure out why certain arrangements of atoms are opaque, that doesn't count as imagining that those same arrangements of atoms are transparent. If you want to imagine that certain arrangements of atoms are transparent, you need to actually show how that works. Same with philosophical zombies, and of course nobody's ever done that. And in general, when philosophers engage in these sorts of conceivability arguments, they don't do that. They don't provide the relevant kind of detail. So Van Inwagen says if we accept the account given by people like Yablo, and we think that conceivability indicates possibility, well, actually we should just suspend judgment about almost all, almost all of the modal claims that philosophers make. So that's it. That's all I want to talk about today. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.